Behind me you can see the outline of Catalina Island. Catalina has always been a very special place for me, and not just because of its physical beauty. Catalina for me represents the bifurcation in American politics. It's really on a fault line between the conservative south and the more progressive north. South of here we have Orange County, and north we have LA, Ventura, and Santa Barbara County. At one point in my career, I was the chair of a small technical materials company just south of Orange County, while at the same time studying counseling psychology at Pacifica up in Santa Barbara County. Every month I would make the trek from conservative south to progressive north, an American tale of two solitudes. But is there really that much difference between the conservatives and the progressives? Well, that's the question that I'd like to address in today's episode of Corporate Courage. Hi, I'm James Fleck, and welcome to another episode of Corporate Courage. I'm a former public company CEO and GE executive, and I've been coaching CEOs and their teams for well over a decade now. When I started the Corporate Courage series a few months ago, I promised myself that I would lead by example and show courage by not shying away from controversial but important topics. In fact, I recorded today's intro during a business trip to California a while back as a way of committing myself to addressing the critical topic of social and political polarization and what to do about it. In the intervening time, I've given it a lot of thought, bounced the idea off of my close confidants, and sought some guidance from the awesome editorial staff at Canadian Affairs, where I'm writing articles to complement these videos. The feedback I've received has ranged from, go for it, somebody needs to honestly address the part that we all play in political polarization, all the way to, are you nuts? Why would you risk getting canceled and possibly annoy some clients? What's the upside? Well, I suppose that's where the courage part comes in. I sense a growing desire amongst reasonable people all across the political spectrum to move beyond extreme black and white thinking and to find some common ground. Now, this still raises the question of why I would address the issue of social and political polarization, given that my business is advising and coaching CEOs. Well, there's two important reasons. The first is that companies and CEOs are increasingly finding themselves embroiled in the culture wars, either inadvertently or sometimes as part of a deliberate marketing decision to appeal to particular segments of society. This can happen in any Western country, not just the US. So it seems to me that it would make sense for CEOs to develop an intelligent point of view regarding polarization and how they want their organizations to address this challenge, preferably before they are thrust into the furnace of controversy. The second reason is that looking at polarization through a psychological lens provides a lot of insights that can make you a better leader. So, here we go. Let's get started with an idea, the horseshoe theory of politics. At its core, this theory seeks to not sort people's views into left and right, but rather, in my own words, into their predisposition towards authoritarian thinking. We have all learned to think about politics as a straight line, with collectivist ideologies like socialism and communism at the extreme left, and corporate military dictatorship, fascism, at the extreme right. But how many times have you noticed in our current environment people hurling insults at each other, accusing the other of being communists, but also fascists, sometimes in the same sentence? And some of these people should know better. I don't think that this is just sloppy thinking. I think it's revealing a deeper truth. And so the horseshoe theory postulates that the extreme left and the extreme right are a lot more similar than most people are willing to admit. I wrote a thesis a number of years ago on the topic of scapegoating in groups. In order to do this topic justice, I researched a wide swath of literature around destructive group behavior, and some of this reading was pretty disturbing. In the book The Psychology of Genocide by Stephen Baum, Baum developed an interesting model where he concluded that 15 to 20% of any population had the predisposition to be perpetrators, to dogmatically follow orders if they were disseminated by the leaders on their side. At the other end of the curve, 15 to 20% of the population were deeply individuated people who would actively resist immoral direction. He called this group rescuers. In the middle was 60 to 70% of the population who he called bystanders. And this was the malleable middle where I'd like to focus, as this group can be recruited to either the cause of the perpetrator or the rescuer. With this model in my mind, I recently read an impressively thorough social psychology paper that examined the similarities between people who engaged in left or right-wing authoritarianism. There were some subtle differences, but many more similarities between the left and right extremes. including a focus on social uniformity, moral absolutism, and prejudiced and punitive thoughts towards their perceived enemies. This paper also made me feel a little more confident about bringing this controversial topic to my audience, as the business leaders with whom I work are smart people, and in this study, there were solid correlations between extremism and lower cognitive ability, as well as lower intellectual humility. So the odds are, if you've made it this far into this video, you're not inclined to be in the extreme right or left. As a final piece to the puzzle, the Pew Research Center recently published a survey on who likes authoritarianism across 24 different countries, and most Western countries scored in the 15 to 30% range. The US was at 32%. These disparate studies overlaid under the horseshoe theory create a really intriguing picture. Rather than categorizing into left or right, or conservative or progressive, I believe it's much more insightful to categorize the population into the 20 to 30% of people who are fundamentally attracted to authoritarianism and the 70 to 80% who are either intellectually individuated people who are fully inoculated against groupthink, the segment that Baum called the rescuers, and then the bystanders, the reasonable but persuadable middle. I'm going to ignore the authoritarian-oriented extremes. To be blunt, changing people who hold such deep psychological preferences towards extremism is probably not possible, and even if some can change a little, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. The priority is to raise the middle, the bystanders, towards the individuated rescuers. This is the antidote to our troubled times. And here's where I start to become optimistic. I've led an interesting life where I've worked and studied in different countries and in different bright red and bright blue states in the US. And in the process, I've made close friendships with people at very different places on the political horseshoe. I know that in the current environment, some of these good people would not be able to stomach being in the same room with some of these other good people, because they would perform a quick litmus test on some hot button issue and decide that the other person was on the other team, that they were the enemy. But what I can tell you from fraternizing across this diverse group is that most of my conservative and progressive colleagues and friends would actually agree on substantive issues, probably more than half the time. And where they would disagree, there would be ways to sometimes close the gap by being creative, understanding, and nuanced, by being reasonable. And yes, there would be times when they would just disagree, but it's unreasonable to ever expect any population to always agree on every topic. And disagreeing doesn't mean retreating to your team bench or maybe dropping the gloves. I've used the term individuation a few times in this video. It's a very specific term in depth psychology, and it's the central idea in elevating the reasonable bystander population. One of the giants in depth psychology was C.G. Jung, and his theories centered on the potential for people to evolve, individuate, throughout their lives. This emphasis on taking personal responsibility for our continued emotional, intellectual, and psychological growth has made Jungian psychology the most important framework for me in my work with high-performing leaders. So how do we individuate? This is a really big topic, and I'm sure I will return to it in future episodes. But fundamentally, it's about doing a deep dive into understanding ourselves and then building the capacity to challenge our hidden preferences, biases, and blind spots, or as Jung called it, the shadow, to find our validation internally, based on what is important to us as individuals, and not externally, based on what our families, communities, or political parties think is correct. I do want to bring this topic back to some practical suggestions for senior leaders. As I said earlier, I believe that most of us watching this video are either highly individuated rescuers or reasonable bystanders with a lot of potential. The single most practical idea I have for you is to really hone your listening skills. I mean, really listen. When I was training in counseling psychology, one of the first exercises we did was to sit in small groups and discuss controversial topics. The first person would speak, but the second person couldn't add their opinion until they had accurately summarized what the first person said, and so on around the group. It sounds easy, but it's not. Even in a group of empathetic, aspiring therapists, it could take 5 to 10 iterations before the speaker was satisfied that they had been properly heard. Please let that sink in. Even in this controlled environment with participants really seeking to understand, they were still missing the mark by a wide margin most of the time. You can play with this listening technique on your own executive team, or more interestingly, when you have a chance to engage with people who hold a different political or social opinion. And if you both fully engage and try to understand and read back the other person's point of view, I guarantee that it will elevate your thinking and build your understanding. In some cases, it might even bridge what you thought was an unbridgeable gap. Now finally, the topic of crisis management when your organization is dragged into a politically charged issue is probably best left to the public affairs consultants, most of the time. But if you're just hearing duck and cover from the consultants when your organization is in trouble, or perhaps advice to double down on one of the extreme ends of the political horseshoe, maybe you need to challenge the experts a little. Show them the horseshoe graphic. There might be a lane to appeal to the rescuers and the reasonable bystanders, the reasonable majority, and you might really gain some credibility doing so. The real head scratcher is when I see organizations sometimes commit to a really extreme position. In this case, they might win over the portion of the extremists on their side of the spectrum, but they're going to lose everyone else. That's a pretty narrow segment on which to build your business. So, if you take one idea from today's video, I really encourage you to use what I'll call my enhanced horseshoe to think about challenging political and social issues and how you should engage with them in your professional and personal life. To be clear, I'm not asking you to go looking for fights or controversy, but rather to have a way to engage when a difficult topic is in your face. Most importantly, as leaders, we can really set an example and encourage others to move along the path of individuation. Frankly, I would be thrilled if something in this video provided a spark for you to further advance the thinking about how to bridge the social and political polarization that threatens all of us. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for watching and listening, and I'll see you next time on Corporate Courage.